Hey everybody, Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701, Research Methods in Criminology. Just picking up where we left off on part 2, we were talking about the literature review. Okay, so again, create that interest with your reader. You're only required to have 6 articles, but again, certainly if you're going to do something more substantial in a senior thesis class or a capstone class, or see yourself going on to graduate study, or kind of want to beef up a writing sample for law school or grad school, you may want to consider getting more, closer to maybe 10 or 12. Okay, but I only require 6. So once you're done with literature review, we go here. Again, just maybe 3 pages is kind of where you shoot for. 2.5 is certainly okay too. But eventually we get into theory. In this part of the paper, theory is where we start to describe why and how we think things work the way they do, even if they don't work the way they do. So people say, well, I haven't tested it yet. How do I even know? You don't. That's why we do science. Science is a test. So in theory, here we're going to talk about an explanation that we propose on how these things interrelate to each other, the process by which things happen. And the very first paragraph to kind of kickstart the theory section is what we call conceptualization. And you can see here, I propose that residential relocation will increase the likelihood of juvenile delinquency. So notice this student used likelihood. Guess which regression they're going to run, okay? Yeah, so you have to kind of look at some language that starts to kind of describe about what you're going to be doing. Okay, residential relocation, the independent variable, will be defined as moving to a different home. So they kept their definition and concept of what moving or relocation really is very general. So that way, for them, they could include people who stayed within state and maybe just changed neighborhoods and so forth. Okay, and then they say juvenile delinquency is the dependent variable. For purposes of the paper, juvenile delinquency will be defined as antisocial or criminal acts committed by a person between the ages of 10 and 18. Okay, so again, they kept this definition a little more general, but said it has to be committed by a kid, somebody under the age of 18. Okay, so this is where we talk about conceptualization. So when you say juvenile delinquency, you mean what? When you say divorce, you mean what? Do they have to be legally separated, or can they just initiate divorce? When you say religiosity, what do you mean by that? When you say conviction, what do you mean by that? When you say fear of crime, what do you mean by that? So kind of give as much detail and parameters as you can so that the reader knows exactly what you're talking about. So this is where you define your concept a little bit better. Before you just launch into an explanation of it. Then the next few paragraphs is that very thing, the explanation. What you should be using here is at least a sociological theory or a psychological theory is okay as well. But I'm hopeful that you choose a criminological theory, since you're in criminology, to start to relate how these things work, whether you're talking about learning, biosocial things, you're talking about processes that have to do with status, or maybe inequalities in the system, or maybe you're talking about something like symbolic interactionism, where our perception really is what frames our reality of how things really work, whether they are that way or not. You can talk about strain and stress. You can talk about all kinds of stuff. So this is where you can introduce your own explanation, but you could certainly weave in some existing theory and draw from those ideas as well. So this section isn't terribly long, maybe a page at the most, just giving the reader an idea of how you think all this works. So this is your grand explanation. Okay. Then we get to data and methods. This is the part where we focus in a lot more for this class. So look at this. The student here is using AdHealth. That's a data set you've been using a lot in class. You're certainly welcome to use that data set for your question, but they just briefly describe what the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health is. They tell them the years it was collected, who was involved. They're using data from Wave 1, different departments that were involved in the data collection, and then finally how they got the data. So it says they use computer-assisted self-interviews, personal interviews, telephone interviews, pencil and paper interviews, and face-to-face. And so they kind of just list and describe the actual method of how they got questions to people and how they responded back. Okay? The next paragraph is sample. So it says, okay, describe who's actually in the data set. So I have kids, adolescents in here from grades 7 through 12. We did multi-stage sampling within homes and stratified sampling to make sure we get all the racial groups. And they stratified all the high schools in the United States and then selected 80 high schools based on region, urbanicity, size, type, race percentages, grade span, and curriculum. Then they selected 52 schools out of that. So I had a total of this many schools. And then you're just kind of walking, the reader through how the data was essentially pulled together. So after selecting the schools, the questionnaire of 90,000 students went out. Approximately 16,000 came back. Then we actually chose students from that group to do the in-home interview with mom and dad. You describe that process, how that happened. So again, it's just a few sentences briefly describing how the people that got the data you're going to analyze got the data. Okay, so this is the part where you're going to have to look in the code book for your study and read through some paragraphs on sample and data and collection methods so that you can write a few statements about how they did what they did. You don't have to write a dissertation length thing. You just have to briefly describe in a couple paragraphs at the most. Then here's the figure that the student did. Again, this is kind of a more elaborate figure than the kind of figures you're going to see most students do. But this just describes all the little pieces that the student wanted to use and the variables, which ones are which. Here's relocation, the independent variable. Here's delinquency, the dependent variable. They used all these different little variables to make up one giant delinquency variable, so you can tell they built a scale. Okay, so this just kind of puts all the variables and the topics together that you're going to test in one big diagram. Pardon me. So then you have your diagram. Also in your method section, you start describing in detail to your reader every single variable that you're going to use. Okay, so right here, the independent variable, residential relocation, is measured with this question. Think about the house or apartment building in which you lived in 1990 when you were blank years old. Do you still live there? No was coded as 0. Yes was coded as 1. That's it, okay? It's just very straightforward writing where you list the question and the topic as well as the available responses. Question, topic, responses. Okay, then check this out. Juvenile delinquency, the dependent variable, is measured on a scale constructed from 22 questions. The student was kind of ambitious and wanted to include all different kinds of behavior as juvenile delinquency. And then they just list what the questions were. It says 10 of those 22 questions relate to general juvenile delinquent activities. In the past 12 months, how often did you paint graffiti, deliberately damage property that didn't belong to you, lie to your parents about where you've been, take something from a store without paying for it, run away from home, drive a car without the owner's permission, steal something worth more than $50, worth less than $50, sell marijuana or other drugs, act loud, rowdy, or unruly in a public place. The 10 questions stated have the same possible responses, which included never coded as 0, 1 or 2 times coded as 1, 3 or 4 times coded as 2, and 5 or more times coded as 3. So you're literally describing what's an SPSS. When you go check the value labels or run a frequency on your variable or go check the code book, you're just describing to the reader exactly how your question's presented and the possible answers within. Okay? And then they said the next 6 questions were measured like this. And they did the same process, putting the actual question wording in the paragraph, describing all the possible responses. And again, you're just listing this. Okay, and then at the end, this was all pulled together to make my juvenile delinquency scale, describe briefly how the scale works. If they had a score of this meant they were highly delinquent. If they had a score of this, that meant they were not very delinquent. Okay, so that's why your method section is so important and why I had you guys do all the labs I did. So remember in your lab, I'd ask you to describe the variable, tell me what's in there, if you had to change any coding to it to write how you did it. That's why. Because in a method section, if you change any of the way the variable is organized and you recode it, you have to describe to the reader what those changes were. So you can say, in here I coded 1 or more times as a 1 and 0 as a 0. I mean, you literally write that just as you would say it in English. So present the original variable first, and then if you recode it at all, which very likely you will have to recode some variables, you describe any changes you made to it right underneath that. Again, in plain English. That's why I did your labs the way I did, to get you used to describing how you recoded it, because this is exactly what goes in your methods section. You have to tell the reader what you did. It's part of our transparency of research. This is what I had, this is how I changed it, so you know exactly what I did, you can replicate it, and you should get the same result. It's a way to make sure that we're very showing our cards to everybody, that we're transparent. Okay, so all of that language goes here in the methods section for each variable you're going to use. And then when you're done describing your variables, what's in there, and any coding changes you made or scales you built or conditions you used, then you can start presenting to the reader descriptive statistics, your tables of what's in your variables, okay? So once you have all your variables organized, you want to run some frequencies that show people what's in SPSS. Remember, your reader does not have your data. They do not have SPSS. They do not have your code book. They know nothing about your data. So you have to present information to them so that they can get to know your data, because they don't have any of that. Excuse me. So these next few pages are all the descriptives. So sometimes it's literally a frequency, and you just present it with the number and the percent, valid n, all the different response categories you have. So this table actually shows all the little parts of the delinquency scale that this student made, so people could see what all the responses looked like before they shoved them all together, get to know what's inside the data. Okay, they also did kind of a table of the final scale as it was pulled together, and they described some other control variables they're going to use. They used religion, they used gender, they used age, and again described what was in the variable, tell me how everything's coded, their mother's work, father's work, and things like that. Okay, so here's a descriptive table for all the control variables. Gender, how many males and how many females did you have? Age, how many 12-year-olds did you have? How many 18-year-olds did you have? They actually did have a few people that were over 18, so you can tell they probably wouldn't be included in the study because that doesn't fit what they described as delinquency, but they listed it there just for information purposes. Here's the religion variable they wanted to do, the family variable they did, mom working out of the home, and so forth. One thing you'll notice about this table is, excuse me, it's pretty straightforward, just percent and number. So they're literally just listing all of these variables, just like the categories that they're in. Now you could argue, well, age is not really a categorical variable. Well, in this way, they're just showing you what ages they have, okay? So it's a way to kind of keep similar things grouped together. So I tell people, put apples in the apple cart and oranges in the orange cart. If you have interval variables and you have nominal variables in the same table, sometimes it's hard to put them together because you're not going to usually produce a mean for a nominal variable. Like if I had a gender variable with males and females, and then I had a mean over here in some column, what's the average gender? That doesn't make any sense, does it? You don't take averages of categories. Okay, it's just how many of the category do you have. So it's kind of unusual to put those two together. So I tell people, put your nominal and ordinal ones in one box, put your interval ones in another box. So you're going to present different kinds of information about them. Okay, so you're not going to have means for nominal variables. You're just going to have means for interval ones, for the number ones. Okay, so again, once you have all that done, you're going to move on to hypotheses. And I'll talk about these in part 3.